In 1902, an archive clerk working through a storage room at the Indiana Postal Authority's regional office in Indianapolis came across something that stopped him cold. He was doing routine classification work, the kind of job nobody wants, pulling old ledgers off shelves, checking dates, deciding what got transferred to long-term storage and what got destroyed. Standard procedure. He had been at it for 3 days when he pulled a leather-bound delivery log from a crate labelled 1866 to 1869, Rural District 4. The log was in reasonable condition. The cover was cracked, but the pages held. He opened it to check the date range and count the entries, just like he had done with the 40 or so ledgers before it. And then he stopped, because something in that ledger did not add up. There were 47 towns listed in the routing index at the front. 47 names. 47 sets of delivery records spanning from January 1866 to late 1868. He was familiar with the district. He had grown up in that part of Indiana, and as he ran his finger down the list of town names, he recognised 46 of them. The 47th he had never heard of. Not once. He checked his reference maps. The town was not on any of them. He checked the 1870 Federal Survey Index kept in a binder on the shelf behind him. Not there either. He went back to the ledger. That town appeared in the routing records every single week from the spring of 1866 through October 1868. Deliveries logged, signed for, receipts recorded. The handwriting was consistent throughout, clean and deliberate, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who took their work seriously. And on the very last page where that town's delivery records ended, at the bottom of the final entry, in slightly different ink, slightly smaller letters, as though written more carefully or more slowly than everything that came before, there was a single line. It said this: "Today no one was there, but the doors were open. The clerk's name was Harold Fenwick. He did not report what he found that day. He finished his classification work, transferred the ledger to long-term storage with the others, and went home. But he wrote about it in a letter to his brother that same evening. That letter survived because his brother kept it, and his brother's granddaughter donated a box of family correspondence to the Indiana Historical Society in 1974. The letter is item number HS-1974-correspondence-box-12. I am telling you this because everything that follows is traceable. The names are real. The archive references are real. And what those records point to is something that the official history of that part of Indiana has never explained and has never tried to. Now, before we get into what the ledger actually documented, you need to understand who Elias Croft was, because this story does not make sense without him. Elias Croft was appointed Postmaster for Rural District 4 in Monroe County, Indiana, in the spring of 1865. He was 31 years old, recently returned from the war, and by all accounts a methodical and conscientious man. His appointment papers describe him as literate, reliable, and known in the community. He had grown up in Bloomington, the county seat, and he knew the roads of that district the way a person only knows roads they have travelled in every season, in every kind of weather, on horseback and by cart and on foot when there was no other option. The district covered a roughly 60 square mile area south and west of Bloomington, taking in farmsteads, small crossroads settlements, a mill town on a creek branch, and several communities that existed primarily because a church or a school had been built there first and people had gathered around it. Croft's job was to pick up outgoing mail at the Bloomington sorting office every Monday morning and deliver it across the district over the course of the week, returning Friday afternoon with any outgoing correspondence collected from the rural boxes along his route. He did this job for 4 years. His delivery records for 1865 are intact and accessible at the Indiana State Library in Indianapolis, catalogued under Postal Records, Monroe County, District 4. His records for 1866 and 1867 are also there, though a portion of the 1867 file is listed as incomplete. His records for 1868, specifically the second half of 1868, are listed under a separate classification that requires written request for access. I will come back to that. When Croft began his route in 1865, he was covering 7 stops. By the spring of 1866, he was covering 8. The 8th stop was a settlement that does not appear in the 1860 federal census, does not appear in any Monroe County land registry before 1864, and does not appear in any state directory published before 1866. It appears for the first time in Croft's own delivery log for April of 1866, listed by name alongside a note in his hand that says new addition to route per district office instruction. That note matters because it means Croft did not discover this stop on his own. He was told to add it. Someone at the district office knew it was there and directed him to include it, which means there is a paper trail somewhere, a communication, an instruction, a record of whoever made that decision. If that paper trail still exists, it has not been made publicly available. For the next 2.5 years, Croft delivered mail to that settlement every week, without exception. His logs are precise. He recorded the date, the number of pieces delivered, the name of the recipient when a signature was obtained, and any notable conditions along the route, washed out roads, downed trees, flooded creek crossings. Normal record keeping. The kind of documentation that tells you a man was doing his job carefully and completely. And what those records tell us about that settlement, read carefully and in sequence, is something that does not fit any official account of what was happening in that part of Indiana in the 1860s. The settlement is described in Croft's logs, not extensively, because a delivery log is not a journal, but in the small observational notes he made when conditions warranted them. He noted in the summer of 1866 that the road into the settlement had been improved since his last visit, graded and laid with flat stone. He noted in the fall of that same year that several new structures had appeared since the previous month. He noted in early 1867 that the settlement had what he called a receiving house, a building apparently dedicated to mail collection, where a designated person would accept the weekly delivery on behalf of the community. He noted the name of that person. She was a woman named Catherine Marin. She signed for deliveries consistently from February 1867 through the summer of 1868. And then her name stops appearing in the logs. For the last several months of Croft's recorded deliveries to that settlement, the receipts show a different signature, one that is described in a note Croft made as unidentified, male, approximate age unknown, which is already strange, because in a small settlement in rural Indiana in 1867, everyone knows everyone. A postmaster who has been visiting the same community for over a year does not encounter a person he cannot identify. That is not how those communities work. Something had changed, and the change whatever it was, appears to have happened gradually enough that Croft kept delivering without raising a formal alarm, but noticeably enough that he documented it. The deliveries themselves also changed. In the early records from 1866 and into 1867, the volume of mail Croft delivered to that settlement was modest but consistent. Correspondence, mostly. A few printed publications. The kind of mail a small but active community generates when it is connected to the broader postal network. By the spring of 1868, the volume had dropped significantly. By summer, it was almost nothing. Croft's logs showed deliveries of 1 or 2 pieces per week, where previously there had been 10 or 12. And by October of 1868, the deliveries had stopped entirely. Not because Croft stopped going. He went. His route records show he continued riding that road. But the log entries for that settlement in October 1868 read, "No mail for delivery." And then, 1 week later, "No mail for delivery." And then, the week after that, the entry that would become the last line Harold Fenwick read 34 years later. Today, no one was there, but the doors were open. Now, here is where the timeline becomes something you need to sit with, because the timing of what happened next is not incidental. It is the whole point. In November of 1868, 1 month after Croft's final entry about that settlement, the Federal Postal Authority issued a revised routing table for Monroe County District 4. That routing table removed the settlement from the district's official delivery stops. No explanation was provided in the routing table itself. The removal was formatted identically to how a stop would be removed if the settlement had been consolidated with a neighbouring community, or if it had been formally dissolved by county authority. But there is no record of either of those things happening. There is no county dissolution order for that settlement in the Monroe County Courthouse records. There is no consolidation notice. There is no record of the population being absorbed into any neighbouring community. The settlement was simply removed from the routing table, and that was the end of its official existence within the postal system. The following year, 1869, the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey issued updated maps for southern Indiana. The settlement does not appear on those maps. It does not appear on the 1870 Federal Survey maps. It does not appear in the 1870 census, not as an active community, not even as a notation of a dissolved one. It does not appear in any Monroe County directory published after 1868. The land on which it stood, and we know approximately where it stood because Croft's route descriptions give enough geographic detail to place it within a specific drainage basin south of Bloomington, that land appears in later records as unimproved rural acreage. There is no record of it ever having been sold, transferred or surveyed after 1868. It simply ceased to exist in the official records, completely and without trace, within the space of about 12 months. And Elias Croft, the man who had spent 2.5 years delivering mail there, filed his final route report in December of 1868 and resigned his position as postmaster the following February. He gave no public reason for his resignation. His resignation letter, a single paragraph, is in the Monroe County Historical Archive. It says only that he wished to pursue other employment and thanked the district office for the opportunity to serve. He was 34 years old. He left postal service and spent the rest of his working life as a land surveyor, a profession that would have given him both the tools and the authority to revisit the geography of that area, whether he did, and what he found, if he did, is not documented in any record that has been made publicly available. He died in 1899. He is buried in a cemetery in Bloomington. His grave marker gives his name, his dates, and the phrase "faithful in his work," which was a common epitaph for the period, but which, given what we know about the kind of records he kept, feels like something more specific than a formality. His daughter kept a diary. The diary is in private family possession and has not been donated to any archive. 2 researchers have sought access to it. One was refused. The other has not publicly disclosed whether access was granted. I will come back to both of them. But first, let us talk about the settlement itself, because the question of what it was is not one that official history has ever seriously attempted to answer, and that absence is itself significant. What we know from Croft's logs, and from what limited corroborating documentation exists, is this. The settlement was not a farming community in the conventional sense. The mail Croft delivered there included a category of printed material that his logs describe, in one entry from 1867, as technical publications of some kind. He uses the phrase "not the usual newspapers or farm circulars," which is the only time in 4 years of logs that he makes any qualitative distinction about the nature of the printed material he was delivering. He does not describe what the publications contained, but the note is there. It means something different was arriving at that settlement than was arriving at the other 7 stops on his route. The structures Croft observed during his deliveries are described in 3 separate log notes across 1866 and 1867. In addition to the receiving house where Catherine Moran accepted deliveries, he mentions a building he describes as larger than a farmhouse, with a roof of unusual pitch. He mentions, in a later entry, seeing what he calls a framework of some kind rising above the tree line on the eastern side of the settlement, which he does not describe further, but which he notes as new since his previous visit. And in his final substantive entry about the settlement's physical appearance from the spring of 1867, he notes that the road leading into the central area of the settlement had been lined with what he describes as dressed stone, meaning cut and shaped, which was not a common feature of rural Indiana roads in the 1860s, and which would have required either imported materials or a level of local stoneworking capacity that no rural Indiana settlement of that era was known to possess. Dressed stone roads, technical publications, a framework visible above the tree line, a receiving house dedicated specifically to mail collection. These are not the characteristics of a struggling frontier settlement scraping by on corn and hog farming. These are the characteristics of a community with resources, with organisation, with a level of physical infrastructure that, if we are being precise about it, should have left a significant and lasting material record. Buildings made with dressed stone do not disappear. Roads laid with cut stone do not vanish without a trace. Whatever was there did not simply blow away in the wind. It was removed, buried, or never documented in a way that was allowed to survive. And that is the detail that researchers who have looked at this case always come back to, because the absence of physical evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, but it is also not natural. The natural state of a settlement with stone roads and permanent structures is that those things persist. You find foundations. You find debris. You find the depressions in the earth where cellars were dug. Aerial photography of that region conducted for agricultural survey purposes in the mid-20th century identified what one surveyor described in an internal report as irregular ground disturbance patterns inconsistent with natural soil formation in the drainage area south of Bloomington. That report is in the Indiana Department of Natural Resources archive. The surveyor who wrote it was not looking for lost settlements. He was mapping drainage for a water management project. The ground disturbance, he noted, was not investigated further because it fell outside the scope of his commission. But it is there, in a government document, describing exactly the kind of physical signature that a demolished or buried settlement would leave in the soil. Now let me tell you about the two researchers, because they are the reason this story has not completely disappeared, and because what they independently found connects the Croft ledger to something considerably larger than one missing Indiana town. The first researcher was a man named Gerald Ames. He was a librarian by profession and a local historian by avocation, the kind of person who spent his evenings reading microfilmed county records for the pleasure of it. Ames became interested in the settlement question in the early 1940s, when he was cataloguing a collection of donated papers at the Monroe County Public Library and came across a box of correspondence from the late 1860s that had belonged to a county commissioner. In that correspondence, Ames found 3 letters that referenced the settlement by name, not in the context of its disappearance, but in the context of its existence. The letters were routine administrative communications, the kind county commissioners exchanged about road maintenance and tax assessment. And in 2 of those letters, the settlement was mentioned in passing as a community within the county that operated, according to the commissioner's phrasing, under a separate administrative arrangement with the state. Ames did not know what that meant. He made a note of it, added it to his research files, and spent the next several years trying to find any documentation of what that separate administrative arrangement might have been. He found nothing, not because the records did not exist, but because every time he traced a reference to the settlement back to a primary source, that source either pointed to another archive he could not access or contained a gap exactly where the relevant information should have been. He documented his search in a 50-page typescript he prepared for his own use and kept in his personal files. When he died in 1961, his papers went to the Monroe County Historical Society. The typescript is there, catalogued under Local History Research Files, Ames Collection. I am not aware of it ever having been cited in any published work. The second researcher is more recent. Her name is not something I will include here, because she is still living and has not given permission for her work to be publicly attributed. But she is an academic, trained in archival research, and she spent approximately 3 years during the early part of this century working through the postal records, the county records, and the Federal Survey documents related to the settlement. She did not start with the Croft Ledger. She started with a different thread entirely. A discrepancy she noticed in the 1870 federal census for Monroe County, where the total population count did not reconcile with the sum of the individual community tallies in the way it should have if the accounting had been done correctly. The discrepancy was not large, somewhere between 40 and 60 people, depending on how you interpreted certain entries. But in a county of that size in 1870, a discrepancy of that magnitude does not happen by accident. It happens when a community is removed from the count after the raw data has been collected, but before the final totals are published. She traced that discrepancy through 3 layers of federal records before arriving at the same drainage area south of Bloomington that the 1940s aerial survey had flagged and that Croft's route descriptions had located. And then she requested access to the second half of Croft's 1868 delivery records, the ones listed under separate classification requiring written request. She was granted access. What she found in those records is what both she and Gerald Ames, working 40 years apart without knowledge of each other, independently identified as the most significant detail in this entire story. And it is this. In the weeks between Croft's last delivery to the settlement and the posting of the federal routing revision that removed it from the district, there is a gap in his logs. Not a large gap. 5 weeks. 5 weeks where the Monday morning entries, which are otherwise present for every week of his 4-year tenure, are simply missing. The pages are not torn out. The binding does not show damage. The pages are there. They are blank. 5 consecutive weeks of blank pages, in a log where every other week for 4 years is filled with careful, precise entries. And then the records resume on the other side of those 5 weeks, with the entry Harold Fenwick would read 34 years later. Today no one was there. But the doors were open. What happened in those 5 weeks? What did Croft see, or not see, or decide not to write down, and during those 5 visits to a settlement that was in the process of ceasing to exist? The blank pages are not an oversight. A man who documented road conditions and the pitch of unfamiliar rooftops and the first names of people who signed for his deliveries did not suddenly forget to keep records for 5 weeks in the middle of an ordinary autumn. He chose not to write it down, or he was told not to. And that choice, or that instruction, is itself a record of something. A record of a moment when a postmaster in rural Indiana understood that what he was witnessing was not something he was supposed to document. Which raises a question that the official history of this region has never answered and has never, as far as I can determine, ever asked. What does it take to make a careful man stop writing? Not a careless man, not a distracted man, but a man who had spent 4 years building a documentary record precise enough that a librarian in the 1940s and an archivist in the 2000s could both use it as a primary source. What does it take to create 5 weeks of silence in that man's record? The answer, if there is one, may be in Elias Croft's daughter's diary, the one that remains in private family possession, the one that 2 researchers sought access to with different results. What we know about the diary comes from a single reference, a footnote in Gerald Ames's unpublished typescript, where he notes that he had been made aware of its existence by a member of the Croft family and had been informed that it contained entries from the autumn of 1868 in which Elias Croft had written about his work, specifically about a period of disruption on his route that he described to his daughter in terms that Ames summarises, without quoting directly, as deeply unsettling to a man not given to sentiment. That is Ames's phrasing. A man not given to sentiment, deeply unsettled by what he witnessed on a postal route in southern Indiana in the autumn of 1868. Now let me tell you why this case does not stand alone. Because if it did, if this was simply the story of one missing town and one laconic postmaster, it would be a curiosity, an interesting footnote, the kind of local mystery that attracts amateur historians and not much else. But it does not stand alone. And the pattern it fits into is one that, once you see it, changes the way you read a significant portion of the American historical record from this period. In the decade between 1860 and 1870, the number of documented settlements in the American interior that appear in federal records before 1865 and do not appear in the 1870 census is larger than the official narrative of westward expansion and community consolidation can comfortably account for. Some of those absences are explicable. Communities failed, people moved, the frontier was brutal, and settlements came and went. That is real and documented and not in dispute. But within that larger set of disappearances, there is a subset that shares specific characteristics with the Monroe County case. Settlements that had infrastructure. Settlements that were not struggling. Settlements that received mail, that had organised community functions, that showed evidence in the records of active and capable populations, and settlements whose disappearance from the official record was clean, sudden, and unaccompanied by any of the documentary residue that a normal community dissolution leaves behind. No probate filings for abandoned property, no land sales, no records of former residents appearing in neighbouring communities, no newspaper notices, no church registry closures, nothing that says these people went somewhere else. Just a before and an after, with nothing in between. The Federal Postal Authority's routing revision records from the period between 1865 and 1875 contain, according to a study conducted by a postal historian at Indiana University in the 1980s, an anomalous number of settlement removals that are not accompanied by the standard explanatory documentation. The study was published in a regional postal history journal with a limited circulation and does not appear to have attracted significant attention. The historian noted the anomaly, suggested it might be explained by incomplete record keeping during a period of rapid administrative expansion, and moved on to other topics. But the number he identified was not small. Across the Midwest and the Upper South, he counted more than 200 routing removals in that 10-year period that lacked standard documentation. 200 communities removed from official postal routes without the paper trail that should have accompanied each removal. Not 2, not 20, 200. And that is only the communities that were on postal routes. Communities too small or too remote to receive regular mail service would not appear in postal records at all. The actual number of settlements that vanished from the official record in this period, if it were ever comprehensively counted, would almost certainly be larger. Now here is where I want you to think carefully about what you know about this period of American history, not what you were taught, but what you know when you look at the primary sources. The 1860s and 1870s in the American interior are presented in the official narrative as a period of growth, expansion, and the steady westward march of civilization. Railroads pushing west, cities growing, the frontier being tamed, population moving outward from the established eastern seaboard into the waiting emptiness of the continent. That is the story. And some of it is true. The railroads were real. The cities grew. People did move west. But the story has a shadow, and the shadow is this. The land those people moved into was not empty. It was not always wilderness. Some of it had been inhabited, organised, and developed by communities that the official records either chose not to document or actively work to erase. The buildings that appeared in American cities in the 1860s and 1870s, the grand post offices, the ornate customs houses, the railway terminals with their vaulted ceilings and their cut stone facades. Those buildings did not emerge from nothing. The labour capacity and the construction technology of the era cannot account for them. The timelines do not work. And the families and institutions that took control of those cities in this same period did not build their power from nothing either. The timelines of their wealth accumulation do not hold up under examination. You put those two things together, the buildings that should not exist and the wealth that has no traceable origin, and you are looking at a world that was already built when the people who claim to have built it arrived. The settlement in Monroe County fits that pattern. It was there before it was supposed to be there. It had infrastructure that rural Indiana in the 1860s was not supposed to have. It received technical publications that a farming community had no reason to receive. It addressed stone roads and frameworks above the tree line, and a dedicated receiving house, and a woman named Catherine Marin, who signed for the mail every week for a year and a half, and then simply stopped. And then it was gone, quietly and completely, removed from the maps and the records and the census counts, as though someone had gone through the official documentation with a very precise instrument and excised every trace of its existence, except for Elias Croft's delivery log, which survived because it was routine, because nobody thought to check a postal ledger, because the people who removed everything else apparently did not consider that a postmaster's weekly records might contain more information than the address labels and the signature receipts. And so the ledger sat in a crate in an Indianapolis storage room for 34 years, until Harold Fenwick pulled it off a shelf and ran his finger down a list of 47 town names and stopped at the one he did not recognise. Now I want to tell you about Catherine Marin, because she is the most specific human presence in this story, and she is the person whose disappearance from the record most demands an explanation. From February of 1867 through the summer of 1868, she signed for the settlement's mail deliveries consistently and without interruption. Her signature in Croft's log is the same each time, a clear and practised hand, the kind of signature that belongs to someone educated and accustomed to formal documentation. Her name does not appear in the 1860 Monroe County census. It does not appear in the 1870 census. It does not appear in any Monroe County birth, marriage, or death record in the Indiana State Archives. There is no Catherine Marin in the Bloomington City Directory for any year in the 1860s. There is no Catherine Marin in any Indiana State record that has been digitized and made searchable. She existed week after week for a year and a half in Elias Croft's delivery logs, and nowhere else in the official record. She was not a ghost. She was a person who signed her name in ink on paper that still exists. But every other document that should have recorded her existence was either never created, or was removed, or was never placed in a repository where it could be found. And she is not the only one. The unidentified male who signed for deliveries in the settlement's final months, the recipients whose names appear earlier in the log, the community that was organised enough to establish a receiving house and maintain stone roads and receive technical publications, all of those people are absent from every other record that should have documented them. A community of that sophistication in that era should have left a trail of legal documents, property records, tax records, wills, marriage certificates, church membership rolls, court records. Every community leaves those things because life generates paperwork, and paperwork accumulates in archives, unless someone removes it. And the removal of records on the scale that would be required to make an entire community invisible in the official documentation is not something that happens by accident or by the gradual decay of paper over time. It is something that is done deliberately by people with access to multiple archives across multiple institutional systems, working toward a single purpose. The purpose being that a community that existed, that functioned, that had stone roads and technical publications, and a woman named Catherine Marin, who could write her name in a practiced hand, should leave no trace in the world except a single line at the bottom of a postal ledger that nobody thought to check. Today, no one was there, but the doors were open. That line is the crack in the wall. It is the detail that should not have survived, the piece of the record that escaped the clearing because it was hidden inside a document that looked like nothing more than a list of addresses and signature counts. And it tells you something specific about what Croft found on that last visit. He went there expecting to find people. He had been going there for 2.5 years. He knew the roads. He knew the receiving house. He knew where to leave the mail when Catherine Marin was not at the door. And on that October morning in 1868, he arrived and nobody was there. Not a sick day. Not a community meeting that had taken everyone to the same place at the same time. Not a harvest event or a Sunday service. Nothing that would explain a complete absence of people from a settlement on an ordinary weekday morning. He writes that the doors were open. Not locked, not boarded. Open. Which means either the people left in a hurry, without the time or intention to close their doors behind them, or the settlement was left deliberately open, as though whoever made the decision to clear it wanted to leave no sign of distress. No locked doors to suggest forced departure. Just an ordinary morning interrupted before it could finish. An ordinary morning that had somehow been emptied of everyone in it. Croft left the mail. That is implied by the log entry format, which only notes the absence of people and does not indicate that the delivery was not completed. He rode away. He did not report an emergency. He did not flag the situation to the district office in a way that any surviving record documents. He came back the following weeks, found the same emptiness, recorded nothing, and then, 5 weeks later, wrote his last entry and stopped. The routing revision came a month after that. Within a year, the maps had been updated. Within 2 years, the census had been completed, and the settlement was gone from the official record entirely, as cleanly and completely as though it had never existed. Except it had. And the people in it had existed. And whatever happened to them in the autumn of 1868, in the weeks bracketed by Croft's blank pages, has never been officially acknowledged, investigated or explained. Here is what the pattern looks like when you step back far enough to see all of it at once. Between roughly 1855 and 1875, something was happening in the American interior that the official historical narrative does not account for. Communities were appearing with infrastructure that did not match their supposed origins. Communities were disappearing without the documentary residue that normal dissolution produces. The federal administrative apparatus, including the Postal Authority, the Land Survey Office, and the Census Bureau, was being used to process these disappearances in a systematic and coordinated way. And the people who populated those communities were being removed from the official records so thoroughly that researchers working a century and a half later can find them only in accidental survivals. A ledger nobody thought to classify as sensitive. a librarian's footnote in an unpublished typescript, a letter kept in a box of family papers donated to a historical society without anyone reading it first. The question of where those people went is the one that the official history has never asked. Not because historians are incurious, but because the question requires acknowledging something that the framework of American history in this period is not built to accommodate. It requires acknowledging that the land was more inhabited than the official record shows, that the inhabitants were more sophisticated than the frontier narrative allows, and that something happened to them that was deliberate enough to require the systematic editing of records across multiple institutions in multiple states over multiple years. That level of coordination does not happen without authority, without resources, without a reason significant enough to justify the effort. And the reason, whatever it was, has been so thoroughly removed from the accessible record that we are left with nothing but the edges of it. The blank pages in a postmaster's log, the irregular ground disturbance patterns in an agricultural survey, the 47 town names in a routing index where only 46 appear on any surviving map, the single line at the bottom of the last entry. Today no one was there. But the doors were open. Elias Croft resigned his position 4 months after writing that line. He became a land surveyor. He spent the rest of his life measuring the same ground he had once travelled as a postmaster, the same drainage basins, the same creek branches, the same geography that had once contained a settlement that no longer existed in any official document. Whether he ever went back to the exact location, whether his surveying work took him to the coordinates where the dressed stone roads had been, and the framework had risen above the tree line, and Catherine Marin had signed her name every week for a year and a half. Whether he found anything there in his years as a surveyor that he did not find in his years as a postmaster, none of that is in the accessible record. His surveying files are in the Indiana State Library. Requests for access to the complete collection, as opposed to the digitized summaries, require an appointment and a research justification. Both researchers who have worked on this case have submitted those requests. Gerald Ames died before his request was fully processed. The second researcher, the one whose name I am not including, submitted her request in the mid-2000s. The status of that request, as of the last information available to me, was listed as pending review. It has been pending for over 15 years. The question is not whether Elias Croft knew what had happened to the settlement. He knew. The blank pages tell you he knew. The resignation tells you he knew. The choice to become a land surveyor in the same district where the settlement had existed tells you he knew, and that knowing it changed what he needed to do with the rest of his working life. The question is what he found when he went back. And the answer to that question is sitting in a filing cabinet in Indianapolis, or in a private family diary that may or may not still exist, or in the grounds south of Bloomington, where an agricultural surveyor noticed irregular patterns in the soil and wrote a report that nobody followed up on. The record was never destroyed, it was buried, and the doors, if you know where to look for them, are still open.